Wonder of the Wasteland, Chapter 14, Part 3. Adam proceeded cautiously behind the burros. They did not like the travel, and, wary little beasts that they were, they stepped gingerly in places, as if trying their weight before trusting it upon the treacherous-looking crust. Adam felt the beat of the sun upon him and the reflection of heat from the valley floor. He'd been less oppressed upon hotter days than this. The sensations he began to have here were similar to those he had experienced in the Salton Sink where he'd gone below sea level. The oppression seemed to be a blood pressure, as if density of the air closed tighter and heavier around his body. At last the burros halted. Adam looked up from the careful task of placing his feet to see that he had reached a perfectly smooth bed of salt, glistening as if it were powdered ice. This was the margin of the place that from afar had looked like a frozen stream. Stepping down upon it, Adam found that it trembled and heaved with his weight. But it held him. There was absolutely no sign to tell whether the next yard of surface would hold him or not. Still, from what he'd gone over, he believed he could trust the rest. As he turned to retrace his steps, he saw his tracks just as plainly in the salt as if they'd been imprinted in snow. He led Jenny out and found that though her hoofs sank a little, she could make it by stepping quickly. She understood as well as he, and when released went on of her own accord, anxious to get this job over with. Adam had to drive the other burro. The substance grew softer as Adam progressed, and in the middle of that glistening stream, it became wet and sticky. The burros labored through this lowest level of the valley, which fortunately was narrow. On the other side of it extended a wide flat of salt and mud, very rough, upheaved as if it had boiled and baked to a crust, then cracked and sunk in places, full of holes and pitfalls, and rising in hummocks, gnarled and whirled like a huge seashell. It was an exceedingly toilsome and dangerous place to travel. The crust continually crumbled under the hoofs of the burros and gave forth hollow sounds as if it was a bottomless cavern under the valley floor. Adam neared the other side, and he encountered thin streams of water that resembled acid. It was necessary to find narrow places in these and leap across. Beyond these ruts in the crust began an almost imperceptible rise of the valley floor, which in the course of a couple of miles led out of the broken choppy sea of salt to a sand and gravel level. Adam was relieved to reach it. He'd been more concerned for the safety of the burros than for himself. It was now hot enough for him to imagine something of what a formidable place this valley would be in July or August. On all sides the mountains stood up, dim and obscure, in distance in a strange haze. Low down the heat veils lifted in ripples, and any object at a distance seemed elusive. That last hour taxed Adam's endurance, though he could have gone perhaps as far again across the lava-like crust. When he reached the slope that led up to the base of the Red Mountains, he halted the burros for a rest. The drink that he took then was significant, for it was the fullest he'd ever taken. And for many years he was hot and wet, his eyes hurt and his feet burned. When Adam had rested, he consulted the map and found that he must travel up the slope and to the west to gain the black buttes of rock that were his objective. And considering how dim it looked through the haze, he concluded he'd better be heading out. One moment, however, he gave to a look at the funeral range which he had come through and which now loomed above the valley. Magnificent and awe-inspiring, it was an upheaval of the earth. The lower and nearer heights were marked on Dismuke's map as the Calico Mountains, and indeed their many colors justified this. Beyond and above them towered the funerals, spiked and peaked, ragged as the edge of a saw, piercing the blue sky, a gloomy and black zigzagged and drab-belted range of desolation and grandeur. Adam's gaze slowly shifted westward to the gulf, a hazy void, a vast valley with streaked and ridged and canyon slopes enclosing the abyss into which veils of rain seemed dropping. Broken clouds had appeared in the west, pierced by gold-red rays. He was amazed to marvelous the day far spent. That scene up the valley of death was confounding. He gazed spellbound, and every second saw more and different aspects. Very immense, unreal, and weird. He got up from that stone seat that had almost burned through his clothes and bent his steps westward, driving the poor weary burros ahead of him. 3 miles toward the black buttressed corner he wanted to gain before dark. His experienced desert eyes calculated the distance. But this was Death Valley. No traveler of the desert had ever correctly measured distance in this valley of shadows and hazes and illusions. He was making 3 miles an hour, yet at the end of an hour he seemed just as far away as ever. Another hour was full of deceits and misjudgments. But at the end of the 3rd hour, he reached a black wall, and the line that had seemed a corner was the mouth of a canyon. Adam halted as if at a gateway of the unknown. The sun was setting behind the mountains that now overhung him, massive and mighty, a sheer insurmountable world of rock which seemed to reach to the ruddy sky. Wonderful shadows were falling, purple and blue low down, rosy and gold above, and the canyon smoked with sunset haze. The map of Dismuke's marked the canyon in a spring of water just beyond its threshold, and also the shack where the strange man and woman lived under the long slant of weathered rock. Adam decided not to try to find that location this night, so he made a dry camp. Darkness found him weary and oppressed. The day had seemed short, but the distance long. Tired and sleepy he was. When he lay down in his bed, he felt a striking dissimilarity of this place to any other he had ever known on the desert. How profound the silence. He had not heard any sound. Had any sound ever pervaded it? All was gloom and shadow below, with black walls rising to star-fretted sky as blue as indigo. The valley seemed to be alive. It breathed, and yet invisibly and silently. Indeed, there was a mighty being awake out there in the black void. Adam couldn't believe any man or woman could live up this canyon. Dismukes had dreamed. Had not Adam heard from many prospectors how no white woman could live in Death Valley? He'd been there only a day, and yet he felt that he could understand why it must be fatal to women. But it was not so because of the heat and the poison wind and the cataclysms of nature. For women could endure those as well as men, but no woman could stand the alternations of terror and sublimity, of beauty and horror. That which was feminine in Adam shuddered at a solitude that seemed fitting to a burned-out world. He was the last of his race at the end of its existence, the strongest, finally brought to his doom, and tomorrow the earth would be sterile. Thus Adam's weary thoughts passed into dreams. He awakened somewhat later than usual. Over the funeral range the sun was rising, a coalescing globule of molten fire. enormous and red, surrounded by a sky broad yellow flare. This sunrise seemed strangely closer to the earth and to him than any sunrise he'd ever watched. The valley was clear, still, empty, a void that made all objects therein look small and far away. After breakfast, he set out to find his burrows. This high-walled opening did not appear to be a canyon, but a space made by two mountain slopes running down to a wash where water flowed at some seasons. Beyond the corners, there opened what seemed to be a gradually widening and sloping field, gray with rocks and sand and stunted bushes, through the center of which straggled a line of gnarled mesquites. Following the course of the wash, Adam found his burrows here, Jenny asleep as usual and Jack contentedly grazing. The cracking of a rock rolling down a rough slope thrilled Adam. He remembered what Dismukes had said about the perilous location of the shack where the man and the woman lived under the shadow of a weathering mountain. Adam turned to look across the space in the direction whence the sound had come. There loomed a mighty mountain slope, absolutely destitute of plants, a gray-drab, million-faceted ascent of rocks. Adam strode toward it, gradually getting higher and nearer through the rock-strewn field. It looked so close as to seem magnified, but it was a goodly distance. Presently he did espy a rude shack. He halted. That could not be what he was searching for. Still, it must be. He'd not expected the place to be so close to Death Valley. It was not a quarter of a mile distance from the valley and not 100 feet higher than the lowest sinkhole, which was to say that this crude small structure lay in Death Valley and below sea level. End of chapter 14, part 3.